Really excited to have Arthur here as our esteemed guest. He's a leading college admissions expert and advisor. And he's able to say this because he was a former admissions chair at the University of Cornell, where he evaluated over 20,000 applications and has over 25 years of experience advising students and parents on both college admissions and also success once you're in college. So thank you very much, Artie, for joining us. And if you'd like to add anything to that might be useful for the students.
Well, I first of all, I appreciate the invitation and the very kind introduction. Really looking forward to speaking to everybody here today. When you mentioned that I had read and made decisions on 20,000 applications, I don't know if people feel sorry for me or think that that's a lot or not a lot, but I enjoyed my years chairing admissions committees, and I did that at Cornell, which was my undergraduate alma mater. But I would want folks to know that the kinds of things I'll talk about today are kind of universal throughout selective admissions and in college admissions, I should say, in general. And my background working with students as an advising dean, and also my work as a college track coach. So I kind of had a fun athletic part of my day as well. It has what's actually motivated me to work with high school students now. I really like working with young people and trying to understand what their goals are, and then working backwards from those goals to help them get there. But I do it now in the context of what are the family and student goals around colleges, and helping people build great college lists and then work on the applications to get them there. But it's wonderful that we have so many people signed up today, because I just think the earlier that students can begin thinking about this, will make the process a lot less stressful in the end. So I'm hoping that our conversation today will provide some information to lower people's stress and anxiety in all of this.
Great. Well, why don't we start with the basics? Very basic. What are the elements of a college application?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing to be thinking about. If you're planning ahead, you need to know what's involved. The most important part of a college application is someone's high school transcript, which of course means their grades and the courses that they chose to fill out their high school curriculum. You know, there's obviously high school graduation requirements, but sometimes you have choice within that, right? So that's an important element that will be the centerpiece of an application. What's also going to be really, really important are the activities that students choose to do outside of the classroom, outside of the school year. So students that work with you, for example, are adding a really invaluable element to their college application, because colleges want to know what makes students tick, what makes them curious, what motivates them, what they chose to do in their time outside of the classroom when they're required to be there, right? So that's an important element, and there's room in the application for that. The other I'll mention kind of three other key elements to the application really quick. There's some essays, and most students probably know that they've probably heard, if they haven't thought about it much yet, that there's a big essay, that it's the centerpiece of an application. That's a personal statement. There are going to be required letters of recommendation. So a guidance counselor at the high school is going to be required to write a letter on behalf of a student, and then the student is going to have the opportunity, in most cases, to pick two teachers to write letters as well. And some universities provide more. You can pick other mentors that you've had in your life as well. And then finally, test scores. Standardized testing is still a part of all of this, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it this afternoon, but they're not necessarily required anymore, but they are still an important element. So transcript, the activities that you do, right? Essays, letters of recommendation, and testing are kind of the five key elements of an application.
Great. And if we're talking about the top schools, maybe 1 in 20 applicants are getting accepted to these types of schools. I mean, obviously you have to be an exceptional student, but that's not enough. What else do you need in this application to make you stand out?
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out. Some of the top schools in the U.S. now have minuscule admit rates, right? Like you said it correctly, 1 out of 20 at many of the Ivy League schools and places like Stanford and University of Chicago and MIT. And that can be very intimidating. All of these schools do admissions with the following philosophy in mind. It's called holistic reading, meaning that there's not one single element that is going to guarantee someone's admission to one of these top institutions. The single most important is going to be the grades and the rigor on the transcript. If that part is not strong, the student is not going to be competitive. But there's several other areas that they look at. And we started to talk about some of those. They're the elements of the application itself. A student finding activities outside of the classroom during the summer that they're genuinely passionate about, that connects their academic strengths on the transcript with what they are articulating in the application is their academic interest in college. Now, I should also add that it's important to be strategic about your academic interests as you express them in a college application. We want your interests to be genuine, but think about it like going to the grocery store. If you've got your cart full of groceries in your Sunday afternoon and you want to get home as quick as you can, and you go to the checkout line, and there's 20 people in one checkout line and there's 15 in another, and they just opened up another checkout line and there's only 2 people in that one, which checkout line are you going to get in? Now, most people I know are not going to get in the one with 20 or the one with 15. They want to get home, and they're going to go get in one of the checkout lines where there's less people. It's a similar kind of concept in selective college admissions. Even though these schools may not be solely admitting by major, we can talk a little bit more about how they filter. Major is kind of a part of it, but it's still this idea that some majors right now are so incredibly popular that so many students write about it that it's hard to stand out from that crowd. If there's a large crowd of 200 people and they're all 5'9", but then there's someone in that crowd who's 6 feet 6 inches tall, you're going to notice them. Well, back to my better analogy of the checkout line, if you're going to pick an academic major where there's a shorter line, there's a better chance that you can stand out relative to the other smaller group of people. Okay, so we want to make sure that students are articulating a genuine academic interest that they've bolstered through participation, perhaps with World Scholars Academy in the summer program or a school year program. That's great, but it would be smart to be thinking ahead and saying, well, right now, computer science, for example, great that you're interested in that, but lots and lots and lots of young people want to do that. Is there another major or program that's similar to that you could build your interests around so that you get in that shorter line? So standing out, really, it does help to be picking an academic interest that's a little bit more unique than your neighbor, while still making sure that you have the extracurricular activities and the grades to back that up. And then the last point I would make in terms of standing out, we talked already about you want to have teachers' recommendations and test scores are a part of this, but an essay that really reveals the kind of person you are, that makes the admissions people like you, makes a big difference. And that surprises a lot of people because, well, shouldn't it all be about the grades and your preparation? Well, yeah, of course, that stuff we just said. It's holistic reading. There's lots of things involved. But if you get the admissions people to like you, you've got a leg up. And so how can you do that? Well, when you apply to college, most of the universities in the US use something that's called the Common Application. There's a 650-word personal statement that's at the heart of that Common Application. And this is not an opportunity to talk about your academic interests per se. You could. This is instead an opportunity to be likable. And there's 3 things that I think can be likable to an admissions officer, speaking as one who is a former admissions officer. If we see students, and think about it this way, if you met anybody in life who had one of the 3 following characteristics, you would probably find them pretty likable, right? So one of them is genuine curiosity, not the curiosity that you're required to do a homework assignment and you do a good job and you show that you're interested in the subject, but the curiosity that comes from signing up for programs outside of the school year that you're not required about, genuinely looking at the world around you and wondering, why does this happen? What is my place in all of this? That kind of curiosity, when we see people that think about that in our daily life, we kind of find them likable. Same with admissions people. The second likable quality that I like my students to find a way to talk about in their personal statement is compassion and empathy, right? Anytime we've met someone in our lives who cares about other people and reaches out to help others, that's impressive, it's likable. And admissions people could admit at these top schools only students with 800 math SATs and still have thousands more to admit with those test scores. But they don't do that because they also want to make sure that these are people that are adding positive value to the community. So compassionate and empathetic applicants can stand out. And then the third and final likable trait is being resilient, the ability to have a setback and show that you can manage that challenge. That's why I like the kind of programs that you offer, because students get tested and go deeply into an area that maybe they haven't had before, maybe is more challenging than they would in a traditional high school environment. And they have to learn how to manage a tough project. Inevitably, when you get to college, it's going to be hard. There's an old expression, the best predictor of what will happen is what has happened. Admissions people love resilient students because you need to be resilient in college. So kind of a long answer, but the essays can help one stand out by being likable in the three ways that I described, and certainly being strategic in thinking about what your academic interests are. They need to be genuine, but if we can avoid the real popular areas and still be genuine about it, you'll stand out better.
Great, that's very useful. Do students need to specialize already in high school to the major that they're aiming for?
Great question. So one of the great things, of course, about most of the top schools in the US is that when you get there, you're allowed to change your mind on what you want to study. You know, you're going to be able to shift gears and might not even have to declare that major until your sophomore year, the kind of that liberal arts foundation to a lot of these universities. So I like students to think about it as I don't want young people to feel the pressure that anything they specialize in high school has to be their career for the next 15 to 20 years. That's not the case. College, you'll get a chance to continue to explore. But it is important to stand out in a particular way with academic interests. So specializing can be useful. Again, what you offer is great because students can pick a particular discipline or area and start to go more in depth into that. And so think of a strong application that stands out, not as a horizontal application, not as a student that is involved in 20 different activities and does a pretty good job and is kind of sort of involved in a lot of things. Instead, applications that stand out are these vertical applications. My other analogy of you have a crowd of 200 people who are 5'9", but one person is 6'6", you're going to notice the 6'6" person. So that vertical application helps, and specializing is a way to go up or dig deeper, whichever way you want to think about vertical, right? So I do like to see students without sacrificing well-rounded interests in the world around them, to find something that they can be very passionate about, be very successful in, and specialize, if you will, understanding, reassuring them that when you get to college, of course, maybe you want to keep doing that. That's great. But you can always change your mind when you get there. This is kind of strategy to get into these top colleges.
I know it's the case that in like top business schools, their rankings are dependent upon how many students reject their offer of acceptance. And so they really want to make sure when they give you a letter of acceptance that you're going to accept it. Is this also the case with universities? And if so, how can you convey that you're going to accept their offer if they do extend it?
It's such a weird part of this process, but at a lot of very top schools, this concept of what's called demonstrated interest does influence the admissions committees. It's kind of a mixed up world. I'm not going to defend it, but schools are dependent in their rankings often on two things: how low their admit rate gets, right? And the second is how high their yield is, how high a percentage of students accept their offers. So for many schools, if they're coming down to the end and they've got a few spots left and several candidates who are all admissible in the sense that they've got the great academic record and the interest and they're standing out, if they can see that a couple of those students have demonstrated interest by visiting campus, they've emailed the regional admissions rep or written letters to, or been in touch with that regional admissions rep. If their essays, and one essay I didn't talk about is many of these schools have what are called supplemental essays that are specific questions about that university. If the student can make a very compelling case for when they were on the campus, they talked with somebody and they really got a great insight into that school, that supplement essay, could really stand out because it's personalized. It's not a cookie cutter kind of essay. Yeah, a college would prefer to admit someone they think might come. Now, the ultimate way to express demonstrated interest, schools that offer what's called early decision, that's the ultimate expression of demonstrated interest, because that application round, for folks that don't know, comes early decision, November 1st. But when you apply early decision, you are saying to that institution, if you admit me, I will withdraw all of my other applications and I will attend. And because of that, the early decision round admit rate for every school that offers it is significantly higher, sometimes 3 or even 4 times higher than the admit rate in regular decision. When, sure, in regular decision, more people apply, so that helps lower it too. But also, admissions people don't know if you're coming. And so they would like to fill as much of their class as they can in that early round because they know that those students are coming. So yeah, demonstrated interest, whether it's by really putting your money where your mouth is, by doing the early decision round, or in non-binding situations, communicating with admissions reps, signing up for official campus tours, doing college info sessions. When the school representative comes to your high school, meeting with that person. These are things that they will keep track of. And as a quick tip, I would recommend that when students go visit a college or a university, or if an admissions rep from that university comes to their high school, if you're going to be in touch with them or you're going to register for anything, use the same email address that you will use in your college application. Don't let your parents sign up for the tour using their email address. Use yours, because these colleges will keep track of, based on the email address you put in your application, the one that you signed up for on the tour. And that's kind of one of the ways that they can verify that you were really there. So take the initiative on the part of the student, use your email address whenever possible, and then make sure you use that same one in your application.
Great. I've heard as well that colleges separate applications by region. Why do they do this, and how can students potentially, use this strategically in their applications?
Yeah, thanks for asking this, and I'm glad this came up, because we talked a little bit about you having a unique academic interest, and I mentioned briefly that schools are not primarily filtering applications by major. They're not. Instead, virtually all of the elite schools in the U.S., without exception, organize their applicant pools on a regional basis, not necessarily where you live, but where your high school is. And the reason that they do this is these schools value diversity in any way that we could think about diversity, not just someone's particular family background or socioeconomic background or racial or ethnic background, but they value geographic diversity. They want students from all over the country. They want students from all over the world. These top universities are national, international institutions that will want to make sure that the student from New York gets to interact with a student who grew up in California or a student from overseas. And they are looking for the most interesting, standout, exceptional people in each of those pools. And so, for example, when I chaired admissions committees at Cornell, I was in charge of the West Coast. So I had Oregon, Washington, California, Arizona, Nevada, but also Alaska and Hawaii. That was its own region. Now, the state of Massachusetts had its own region. The state of New Jersey had its own region, because there was a kind of a similar number of applicants from New Jersey as there was from the entire West Coast, if that makes sense. So the admit rates were not very different. But I will say this, the admit rate that I was allowed to have for my group was just a little bit higher, not a lot, a little bit higher. Now, why is that? Because not as many West Coast students necessarily were going to attend. We hoped they would. We wanted a good yield, but we wanted to make sure that we had a good number of West Coast students in the group. We wanted to be able to say that we had a student from Wyoming and that we had a student from smaller states. So one way where this could work to someone's advantage, let's say a student is from Northern California, and I'll just pick two elite universities. They're interested in Harvard and Stanford. They're going to have a better chance. It's still not an amazing chance, but they're going to have a better chance at Harvard than they will at Stanford. Why is that? Because lots and lots and lots of kids in California want to apply to Stanford, and a little bit less will apply to Harvard. And so that's a slight edge. Similarly, the student in Massachusetts, where lots of high school, everyone's trying to get into Harvard there, applies to Stanford, they're going to have a slightly better chance out west. It's kind of an overly simplistic example, and the advantages are not huge, but on the bigger scale, that's a useful thing to know, that if a student is willing to look further afield at highly selective schools, that may help them. I want to emphasize that within these regional pools, the regional admissions directors drill it down to the high school level. I'll give a quick example. When I took over the West Coast, the person who handed it off to me had been in charge of that region for over 20 years. I ended up doing it for almost 15. So over a 35-year period, there were two people that were in charge of that region. We got very familiar with those high schools. And the gentleman that handed it off to me gave me copious notes on the high schools. And one thing he said to me was, hey, this one high school down in San Diego, if you ever see a student in the junior AP English class that gets an A, you should admit them. Just admit them. And I said, well, aren't we kind of normally expecting to see an A? And what about the other grades? And he said, no. The teacher there's been there for a long time. He never gives A's. He might give one every 10 years. And that means that's a truly exceptional student. So sure enough, about 5 years later, got my first student from that high school that actually got an A in that AP English test. Now, keep in mind, we were admitting students, even though everyone else was getting a B every year, because I knew that was a hard grader. But when I saw that student get an A and she wanted to study English, she wasn't particularly amazing in her other classes. She was good. But this was clearly the best English student that teacher had in 5 or 6 or 7 years. So we admitted her. Happy ending. She became the editor of the student newspaper at Cornell. And I was really pleased. I saw in the news recently, she won a Pulitzer Prize for journalism for the LA, for the Los Angeles Times. So that worked out really great. And that's where regional admissions is working best practice. You're really learning what's exceptional in a particular high school, in a particular region. And that's why they do it, because they really want to make sure they're picking the best kids, best students in different parts of the world.
So it seems like admissions officers really have quite an intimate knowledge. They have long tenures on these committees, and they have really intimate knowledge of the different high schools and even teachers within the high schools, which seems quite amazing. So yeah,
those that have been doing it a while, and that's usually the admissions chairs, because you'll have other people helping you. But yeah, they really take that part very seriously. You're right.
Now, we've got a number of international students in our programs, and I know it's not so popular in the United States, but in Britain, for instance, something called a gap year is very popular. You take a year off between high school, oftentimes to do some work or some travel. Other times in the U.S., students can take an additional year of, like, senior year of high school type of thing. How do admissions committees in the U.S. look at these types of activities?
So a gap year can be potentially game-changing for some students. And I'll give a couple of reasons, a couple of categories where that could be particularly helpful. But let me just tell you why. We talked about resilience and curiosity and compassion and empathy. It's what you do in that gap year that can really add value to your application. And more often than not, these are more real world kind of experiences that students get. And that only helps to develop those three attributes. And if a student chooses in that gap year, it could be more academic work, certainly, but if they're choosing to give up their time to help other people, if they're exploring new passions and interests outside of the context of their peer group, that kind of initiative really helps develop that resilience and that curiosity and the compassion. So oftentimes that can be really, really helpful. And where I think it can be particularly useful is, let's say a student maybe got off to a rough start in high school, and they're on a great upward trend in grades. And maybe in the summer they've done your program which is great, or been involved in your program at various points. And so they're building on their resume, but there's that early part of high school that just is a concern. Well, doing a gap year can kind of further develop the resume and further allow them to explore their curiosities, so that ninth grade year just is further in the past. It's less of something that's dragging them down. The admissions people are looking at this mature student who has really gone out on their own to do some neat things and is presumably much more serious now about starting school. And that you don't have to do a gap year maybe you had a great 4 years of high school the whole time and you just need a year to explore some other interests. Most admissions people that I know really value that desire to seek out new things, but it comes back to what will you do? And hanging out at home and playing video games isn't a good use of a gap year. It's going to need to have a plan. And if you think of, again, it come back to those three characteristics: the resilience, the curiosity, the compassion. If you can find some things that test those, you're on the right track. I'm a big fan of it.
That's great. Well, we're talking about curiosity, resilience, compassion, and you've obviously seen tens of thousands of college essays. What are some of the favorite essays that you've read that made an impression that can kind of give our audience here a sense of what they should be aiming for?
So one of my favorites, and let me back up a second. I think a lot of times students get overwhelmed by this essay because they feel like, to stand out with all the numbers they're hearing, 1 out of 20, and how scary this can sound, that they need to come up with an essay that's a topic that it's so amazing it would be on the cover of the New York Times or Time magazine. And I actually like people to don't think that big. Like you don't have to do that. And in fact, as someone who's read 20,000 applications, there's very few topics that have never been done, right? Someone's done something along those lines. But what makes it stand out is if it's personal to you. So often the subject that is the most mundane to the student, well, I just do that every day, that could actually be the most interesting thing and reveal all of these things. So one of my favorites, now to answer your question, was a young woman who had a 1 mile walk through her neighborhood to get to her high school. And she talked about how she liked to take a different route every day because she discovered something different along the way. And we learned so much about just her innate curiosity and just the idea, the creativity of that, and that she wasn't just kind of following the same path. But we also learned a lot about the community that shaped her. And she told some really neat stories about the different people she would meet every day. Now, I can't think of anything more mundane to a high school student than how you get to school every day. I mean, that's just something you do every day. You don't think of that as something that's a big deal. But that was a really, really kind of, I thought, very, very interesting essay. Another one that really stood out to me is a young man who founded a tutoring company. We'll call it a company, but a tutoring organization at his high school. And he had a little bit about how he started it. That was helpful. But it was really the middle part of the essay where he talked about really influencing a ninth grader at his school who was at a point of just kind of really going off the deep end and having maybe not even finishing high school, and how this organization really helped and kind of turned that young man around. I mean, talk about, compassion, talk about curiosity, talk about taking the initiative. And he just wrote it in a really personal way. It wasn't resume like, I founded this is what I did. We had a little bit of that. It was more that personal connection to the young man that he helped. He really humanized this really good organization that he set up.
Great. Thank you for those examples. One of the things that's been kind of trending in recent years is making standardized tests optional on applications. And what would you recommend for students who are trying to get into these elite schools with regard to that?
So it's such a big change, right? In the last few years with standardized testing. If 4 or 5 years ago, 100% of students admitted to top colleges and universities had SATs or ACT scores, 100%. And we're not near 100% anymore. And I think this is a really good change. I anticipate test optional and even test blind test practices to stay. I think admissions people are realizing, many already had, that standardized testing is not predictive of who's going to do well in college. It was simply a tool to select. And there's other ways to select. I mean, it certainly makes it easy if you've got a great test score, but it's not the only thing. So that's the good thing. And that's the thing I would kind of tell people, that, if you can't do well on it, that's not the end of the road. However, it still can help. It's still something that, if you can do well, for test optional schools that are saying it's not required, but hey, if you have them, we'll take them, it will still enhance your chances. And I'll just give you some basic statistics. Last year at the Ivy level, Ivy schools and the Ivy peer institutions, about 50% submitted test scores and about 50% did not. 70% of those admitted had test scores. So that should tell you right there that it did help more. But remember, I'm a glass half full, not a glass half empty kind of person. 30% of students didn't have them at all. And that is a fundamental change. And that number may grow a little bit, but until it becomes exactly 50-50, that test scores can help. So I look at testing not as test optional, but I like to explain it and encourage families to think about it as testing opportunity. If you can invest time in test prep and do well, it can still move the needle. But clearly, there's a third of the freshman classes, at least, that are getting admitted without them. Now, in certain types of majors, STEM, computer science type majors, I suspect if we went granular into the detail, that the SATs matter even still a little bit more than in some other areas. But for students that aren't great testers out there, I don't want them to despair. I just had a student get into Harvard early round who had she did not break 1,200 on her SAT. We did not submit that, and she still got in. So it's possible. But why wouldn't you, if you care about this process, try to do everything you could to help yourself? Therefore, trying to take advantage of the opportunity to enhance your application with good test scores makes sense to me.
But she still submitted a test score, right? So
so Harvard's test optional. So
right.
She had the test score, but with 1,200, we chose not to share that with them.
I see.
Yep. Okay. So she was admitted, but they had no idea what that was. If she had been, I'm guessing a little bit because it's hard to say, but highly educated guess here, right? If she had been 1,550 or higher, that would have helped her.
Yeah. If
she had been 1,450 or higher, we probably would have submitted that because it wouldn't have been perceived as a negative in any way. That's still a really good score. But under 1,450, that they wouldn't have liked that. So we didn't do that. That's Harvard, right? The scale is different depending on the institution you're applying to. Now,
I know you don't want to give hard numbers, but it's very useful actually to hear for someone who had boots on the ground with this, yep. What kind of scores, what they mean actually to an admissions committee.
They mean. And if I can add real quick, one way to kind of quickly, rule of thumb, back a napkin kind of way to do this is these schools do publish, their average SAT score. But what's actually more helpful is to look at the 25th to 75th percentile of test scores for students who were admitted, not that was submitted, but was admitted. And if you're in what would have been the top quartile, so above that 25th to 75th percentile range, like definitely submit it. Like that's a positive add value to your application. It's not enough to get you in. Remember holistic reading, we talked about that earlier, but that's viewed very, very positively. And at Harvard, that's going to be mid 1550s and higher, right? Yeah. But anything 25th to 75th percentile, and this is where a counselor can help, you want to at least consider whether you would submit that. If it's below that 25th percentile and it's a test optional school, don't submit it.
Did Cornell keep track of retrospectively how students did in their school and what they submitted, maybe in terms of SATs on their test scores, and then from this kind of develop this picture of what's important in applications?
Yes. Definitely. And that's another thing about regional admissions, right? And getting to know a particular high school. There may be a high school that produces students that have gone on to Cornell or any of these schools that do fantastic, but maybe it's maybe the resources there aren't the same, and maybe there's not the same emphasis on test prep. And we have a track record of students we've admitted from this high school, but haven't had great testing. Okay, I mean, that's fine, right? We know what this high school does. So they look at it in multiple ways. It's test scores and what that leads to, but it's also, if you have older students at your high school that are now off in college, you want to root for them to do really well. Because as an admissions dean, I kind of followed how if I admitted a cohort from a particular high school, 2 or 3 kids over a couple year period, I kind of wanted to see how they did. And if they did well, that gave me more confidence that I was going to keep looking at that high school really well. But if I admitted 4 or 5 kids over 2 or 3 years and they were struggling, that hurt that high school in future years. And that may not sound particularly fair because these are different kids, but if they had the same academic preparation and they're struggling, and then the next candidate is applying to the same kind of program with the same preparation, so you want to root for your older friends to do well when they get to college.
Great. One of the things that I've thought about in terms of applying to college is this movie Legally Blonde, where Reese Witherspoon submits a very colorful video to apply. I think it's to Harvard. Are there supplemental materials that you can submit as well in a similar vein? Is this?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And I should have mentioned that earlier, actually. Depending on the kind of interests and talents and passions that you have, there is an opportunity to submit supplemental materials, particularly if a student is very involved in the arts and music. So most of these schools encourage the submission of music performances, and they'll even ask their music faculty to review it. And every once in a while, there'll be someone that's so off the charts with their musical ability. The music faculty are like, this person will add significant value to the musical community at our school. And that ends up becoming a really important part of the reason we're going to admit that person. If a music faculty member is that impressed, we want to provide them with good music students, or at least good people that can be in the orchestras and the bands. And the same sort of thing goes with art. I never, with either music or art, most admissions people aren't going to be the ones to evaluate that. But if there is that submission, they'll bring in faculty in that particular area to look at it. And if a student is interested in architecture or art, and that's an undergraduate program, it probably won't even be supplementary. It'll be required that they submit an art portfolio. But let's say I had a student who applied and was interested in STEM, but was also an artist, and they wanted to submit kind of some pieces of their artwork. I would ask the art faculty to at least look at it just to give me a sense. But I kind of would like that idea that here we have this exceptional STEM student who also has this cool art ability for a liberal arts and sciences college within Cornell. That's great that you have someone who has this, again, the verticality of the STEM interests and strength, but shows that they are curious and artistic in other ways. Now you're really standing out from the crowd. So I do encourage those kinds of submissions, but it's worth also seeking out help from your music teacher, your art teacher, to make sure that you're presenting it in the best possible way.
Thank you. And we have a quite broad international group of students who join our programs. I was wondering what you'd say to a student, say an American student who wanted to study abroad, or vice versa, an international student wanted to study in America. What should they be focusing on in their application? And then after Artie asked this question, I'm going to open it up to the floor to have some of the students ask their particular questions to Artie.
Well, I'm always so impressed with young people that have the maturity and the interest to and the confidence to be ready to go study internationally. I think that's really great. And one thing I would tell any student who's interested in studying in the U.S. is that many, if not all, of the top U.S. universities have wonderful study abroad programs. In fact, some of them, NYU is one, Northeastern's another, even offer an admissions path where you do your first year on one of their international campuses in London or in Paris, and then you transfer back to Boston or to New York. And so, international study abroad or taking advantage of one of those programs can be a way to kind of have the best of both worlds. But to an international student looking at the U.S., one of the challenges is it's a big world out there, and the international applicant pool is not broken down into as many subregions as the U.S. is. So it can be challenging to get into a top U.S. school from outside the country. But the priorities that one needs to place in the application are the same. And if that student can find an academic interest, preferably one that maybe isn't super popular amongst international students applying to the US, and can excel within their own community, that's how they're going to stand out. Mm-hmm. And along those lines, we have a lot of international students, I totally understand it, who want to come to the States and study in these amazing engineering and computer science departments. Great. And if that's where your passions are, that's great. But if there's any way you can kind of diversify those academic interests and pick an institution, a fine liberal arts college, Dartmouth College, and show that you're interested in some other things, you can still major in computer science when you're there, but try to direct your application towards an academic program that's perhaps a little bit less of a line that goes all the way out the back of the grocery store, right? That's important for international students to remember.
Thank you very much. So if you want to ask a question, just type into chat that you'd like to go next. But I think Elijah has some questions that he'd like to present to Artie. Elijah, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I guess a question I had was seeing the trend towards maybe moving into the workforce without a college degree. Mm-hmm. What do you see as some of the fields where that may be a bit further out? Like, what are some of the fields where you would say probably a college degree is really going to be needed for the near future, 5 to 10 years, versus some of the careers where maybe something like individual training, or just taking, a lot of universities are putting their courses online where you can build the skills without the credentials. So maybe if you could comment a bit on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad this came up because, we work with students all the time after we kind of start building a college list and identify their academic interests, that it sometimes is the case that college isn't the right fit either right away or not at all, because going right into a trade or, having a clear ambition for a certain profession, a college degree isn't necessary right away. And that's why it's important for students and families to kind of really look in the mirror and assess their interests. But there's no question that a college degree in certain areas is going to give, a young person a heads up in particular fields. And anything related to STEM, computer science, engineering, depending on where that student wants to go in those areas, it's so competitive right now that not having an undergraduate degree really puts you behind in computer science or engineering. It's just hard to avoid that. If someone wanted to go into law, to be a lawyer, it's imperative that they have an undergraduate degree so they can put themselves in position to go to law school and take the bar. Same with anything in medicine. It's a little bit more interesting, I think, however, with business. And this is where a lot of people feel like, well, I've got to go to college to be an undergraduate business major. I have no objection to that, but that's not the only path. There can be a non-college path to starting your own business. And if you have a particular skill or trade that you've learned and you can add value with your own business, an undergraduate business degree is not necessary. But I would add that an undergraduate degree, even if it's not in business, can serve someone extremely well someday when they're running their own business and hiring and managing people around them, or as they work their way up any kind of company. There's an interesting stat from a few years ago that if you looked at the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that 75% of them were an undergraduate liberal arts person in college, that they got a Bachelor of Arts. They weren't doing economics necessarily. They weren't doing computer science necessarily, but they're running these companies later because they got this well-rounded education that prepared them to lead and understand and manage people and solve problems. But to answer your question specifically, I would really encourage a student with any science, STEM, medicine, computer science interests to think carefully about college, because it's so competitive now in those professions, and it just would be difficult to succeed without them. And I would certainly throw in the law as well.
Great. Thanks for that, Artie. Next, we have Claudia. There's a question, I believe, on what majors you should aim for.
Majors to aim for. Great question. So
she says in particular, I was going to let her.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
She says in particular, if you want to apply for a French major, will that make an Ivy application easier? And then the broad question of that is, what are the areas, the disciplines that would increase your chances of getting into the college that you want to?
So that's a great question. And if I can use French as an example, the Romance Studies departments, the French department at most of these colleges is not as popular as economics or computer science or biology, right? And so if a student applied and there's clear evidence that not only did they take 4 years of French, but that they had done work in the summer in a French-speaking environment, or that they had taken on extra projects to learn more about French literature. In other words, if there was real evidence that they weren't just good in the French classroom, but were pursuing this interest outside the classroom, yeah, that application is going to stand out. But if that student had taken their 4 years of French or 3 years of French, but was actually fluent in Spanish or Italian, and all of their activities were centered around robotics and computer science, that's not as compelling, right? So it's not as simple as let's find the shortest line, I'll just run over there. You got to find the line that you're actually interested in that's shorter. You got to find the line that's shorter that you have experiences that make an authentic argument for being in there. But right now, in general, I would say that the humanities and many social science majors are not as common in applications right now. So if a student has the time during high school to test those interests out outside of the classroom through, programs like yours, that's going to make it seem more authentic. And yes, they'll be more successful. Right now, we have very, very few young men interested in humanities majors compared to 20 years ago. Less young men that want to study English, classics, history. Something to think about for them if they have that genuine interest.
Thank you. Oliver has a question on a similar vein. How do colleges look at students who do well in school but don't have a particular passion or major that they're set on yet?
Great question. So there's nothing wrong with being undecided. In fact, many of the top universities in this country, technically you are undecided when you walk in the door. They're not saying you have to be a bio major on day one. They might like seeing that this biology interest that you have has been cultivated and developed and built up. But they're also going to be fine with the student who's undecided, as long as that undecidedness is not what I like to call profoundly undecided. Profoundly undecided is, I'm not interested in anything. I want to go to your college because you'll help me figure it out. And, I'll get a great degree and I'll figure out what I want to do someday. That's profoundly undecided. If you're undecided because you've got 2, maybe even 3 things that you really love and you're just not sure what you want to do, that could be great. But again, the things that you would want to focus on in that application essay or the application, those 2 or 3 things, let's make sure that you've invested in time and experiences in those areas so that they understand why you have those interests. But that undecidedness is based on multiple interests. That's great. Undecidedness based on lack of curiosity in the world around you, that's not going to go anywhere.
Great. So maybe try to say, well, there's these few areas I'm interested in, at least narrow it down to there's this subset of things that, yeah, yes, I could go into. I'm not sure. I'm still exploring it, and just be honest about that and genuine. I mean, it's interesting too. Like when I evaluate essays in the same way, when students try to exaggerate or pretend or are very I don't know, bombastic in their language, or it's clearly that it's not true to them or the situation at hand. It comes across as inauthentic, and I don't look on that very favorably at all. I imagine it's similar
It's
in
exactly
college.
it's exactly how folks feel. Yep. So talking intelligently about a couple of things you clearly are passionate about, you don't have to pick between those. Let's show them your versatility. That's great. I look at it as being versatile, not being undecided. That's the way to think of it.
Right. Another question we have here from Olivia is about so law is an interesting discipline because there's many channels that can feed into it from an undergraduate degree. And her question is, for a student who's been very active in Model United Nations, what undergraduate degree would you suggest if this student wanted to go into law, or at least target on their application to say that this is what they want to study at your university?
So someone who's done Model UN, I think looking at whatever the college calls it, but it could be government or political science, it depends on the university, how they call that, would be an obvious one that connects back to that high school involvement in Model UN. Sociology is another that works really well, potentially economics, definitely history. And these are all majors that are very common for students who end up applying to law school anyway. But if you're trying to get into the undergraduate university and you've got this great Model UN experience here, and you've got the ultimate goal of law down the road, talking about government, history, political science, economics, sociology, and a couple of those in the application, and that you ultimately want to be a lawyer, that's going to resonate with an admissions committee. Those dots are all connecting. Right. And so those are the routes I would take. But I would also want Olivia to know that law schools, they'll admit people who were biology majors in college. Right. I mean, as long as you can do well in your classroom, show that you're a good writer, do well on the LSAT, you don't have to have one of those majors. So would just want to reassure someone who midway through college moves from science to a law interest. That's appropriate. But for this student trying to get into college to eventually be a lawyer, I think the safest path, given the Model UN interest, is to talk about social science majors.
Great. And then we got another question from Rika on how much value do grades have over extracurriculars? So I think you said the components of a college application are the transcript. That's really most important. So that's your grades and what subject you studied in high school. So including any honors courses or AP courses, and then your activities outside of school. So these extracurricular activities, your essay, letter of recommendation, and testing. So I guess they're asking how important is extracurriculars in there? What are some of the things that maybe some concrete examples of extracurricular activities that were really quite exceptional and that piqued your interest?
So, just to keep in mind, I mean, the grades are more important, right? Because if there are C's and D's on a transcript, it doesn't matter how great the extracurricular list is, right? But there are so many students with great grades that it really becomes things like the extracurriculars that gets a student over the top. And what I would prioritize is developing leadership roles in a student's extracurricular club or activity. And leadership can mean a lot of things. It doesn't have to formally be that you were elected president. You can be a leader and not have the title, but demonstrating that you invested the time and the energy into making that group better than it was before you arrived. That's what good leaders do. And so it's about quality, not quantity. Now, it's also okay for younger students to not feel bad if they tested out a club or an activity in 9th or 10th grade and then didn't continue with it. But ideally, by the time you got to 12th grade, there'd be a couple things that you did do over 2 or 3 or 4 years. Colleges are very forgiving of students taking risks, trying on different things early in high school, but going as deeply as you can into the things that really define who you are at your high school. This is the club everybody knows that you care the most about. that's what's going to stand out. And so being the president of a club, yes, is great. But if you don't get that title and you can still show that you made that club better through your 4 years of participation, that's going to add a lot of value.
So yeah, so highlight the positive changes that you've made in the organization since you've been there, the positive effect that you helped bring about.
Make it better than you found it when you got there, and you have been a leader, even if you don't have a title. Absolutely.
Great. I guess we'll do one final question. We'll come back because we don't have any new questions from new people to Elijah. Do you have advice for prioritizing the universities to which a student applies? So how do you order where to focus on for your applications?
That's a great question. And I do notice there was one question from someone up top that I'm happy to answer as well, about high schools in good standing. But let me take Elijah's question first. So one of the biggest mistakes families can make, to me, is applying to too many schools. And you'll read about, might even know people that apply to 20, 25 schools. And this is a really hard one for people to buy into. But when I advise students and they get to know me, I think they start to trust me. You will be more successful if you apply to 10 to 12 to 15 than if you apply to 20 or 25. That's my magic number, 10 or 12. I see it working if you do as many as 15. But more than that, you're spreading yourself too thin. Now, this is hard for people, high achieving people, to accept. Well, no, I'll just work harder. It doesn't work that way. There's no student I've ever met who, after a dozen applications, the 13th, 14th, 16th, is as sincere and authentic as the ones that came before it. There's only a finite amount of that really connection that you can build. So the first thing I always want students to prioritize is letting go of this insecurity that you need to apply to every school out there. It's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to identify what it is that you really want. What are you seeking academically, socially, environmentally, geographically, and then let's build a list from there. Now, in that list, I always recommend, and we work closely with students on this, you want to have two what are called likely schools. What is a likely school? Based on your academic record, me or my colleagues can kind of reassure you that this is a school that you will get into. We're not worried about it. Everybody should have two schools like that on their list, at least. You also want to have what I would call a target school. That's a school that, based on my experience in this process, you should get in. I expect you to get in, but it's a weird enough process that if we applied to 4 of those, maybe you might get into 3 of them, but it wouldn't be worse than 3. Probably be all 4, but there might be an odd rejection in there because sometimes the sheer numbers of applications just fall through the cracks in a way that we can't predict. So that's giving the student already, if you're following along at home, around 5 options already. That's great. And so the rest of them would be what I would call the reach schools. What's a reach school for any applicant in the country? That's a school that admits less than 20% of its students. I mean, that's 1 out of 5, because these are all good candidates in most cases applying. Nobody, I don't care how good they are, even if they ended up getting into Harvard, nobody can say that if an admit rate is under 20%, that they were definitely going to get into that school. So it's good to have more of those. It's okay. But I don't like seeing students apply to 15 or 16 of those schools. Again, you want to have a couple likelies, 3 or 4 targets, and then you can fill out the rest with the reach schools if that's the ambition of the family. And then I work with lots of students, even though I work with tons of families that want to work with me because they aspire to those reach schools and we do a great job helping them. I work with students who I don't need to worry about the reach. I just want to find the best fit for me. And maybe it's not as selective as somewhere else, but it's the right fit for them. Well, that's what this is all about, is finding the right fit for that particular student. And do you mind if I quickly, because I think it might, I'm not sure, the question about, how do we know the high school is in good standing with a college or university? Best way to, and that's a great question, and I just want to reassure parents on this in particular. Best way to do that is just to ask the guidance counselor, because they will keep track of this. What's our placement at these schools over a 5-year window? Right now, 4 years is probably better because go back 5 years, that's pre-pandemic, right? But and if that school has not been getting anybody in, you're not in good standing, okay? But if kids are, then that's good. Now, it might be that nobody's getting in because nobody has applied. That's another follow-up question to ask. Okay, nobody from our school has gotten into the University of Pennsylvania in 5 years. Well, the second question would be, has anybody applied? And if 10 have been applying every year, nobody's getting in, your school's not doing great. And that might not be fair, but that's just something to know. It doesn't mean you can't try. You might become the first in a while, but that just gives you a sense of the lay of the land.
Great. And then if you have a few more minutes, Claudia also asked, can you give an example which medical school offer BS plus MD assurance?
Yeah. Sure. So
can you explain what that is? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, happy to. So BSMD is, some people like to call it. Some universities offer admission to undergraduates and concurrently admit them into the medical school. So instead of being a 4-year undergraduate program, it's a 7-year program, and they're not starting medical school as a freshman. They're going to be an undergraduate, but essentially you save a year of undergrad or a year of med school, depending how you want to look at it. Because normally you would do 4 years of undergrad, take the MCAT, apply to medical school, and then you'd have 4 more years of medical school. Well, in being admitted to a BSMD program, those 8 years get combined into 7. You stay at that same institution, and you don't have to take the MCAT. So for a lot of people, that's really, really appealing because they are 100% certain they will be a doctor. And I don't have to take the MCAT and I'm already in. I would emphasize that some of the schools that do this, I'm thinking Temple does this. There's several. Rice used to, but doesn't anymore. Brown has one. That the admit rates for the BSMD program, I don't think this will be a surprise, are much, much lower than they are for a typical admission. And it's not uncommon for the student to just be admitted to the undergraduate university, but not be admitted to the BSMD program. Now, Brown is one of the is probably the highest ranked university that I can think of that has this. None of the other Ivies do. Stanford, Duke, Chicago, they don't do this. And that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but they really are trying to prioritize. You're here for undergraduate. You can then decide what you want to do. And I think the only disadvantage to it that I can think of is that many students, when they get to college, change their academic and career trajectories. And that's one of the great things about college. And so, are you really willing to say with 100% certainty, this is what you want to be doing 7 or 8 years down the line? If it is, and you can get in, it's obviously, it provides a lot of benefits for people, but it's competitive, extra competitive. Not that many schools do it. I hope that was her question. Did I answer her question?
I think you did. Yeah, that's really fascinating. In the UK, it's something similar. You specialize a lot earlier. In the UK, yes. Even right after middle school, you start specializing. Yeah. And when you enter undergrad, you'll be studying medicine. You'll be there for 5 years. So you'll be studying law, and you'll be, it's a normal undergraduate degree that leads right on to that professional qualification, which is fascinating.
And I think it is more. It does sound, the UK system is so different than the US in this way, right? So many of the US universities, so general for the first couple of years, but this is kind of more along that, let's dive right into it kind of mentality or philosophy.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Well, we got one from M. Clark here. How does it look if you're in a civil engineering pathway in high school, but choose to go into business, meaning a student's high school may have a program offering what they'll choose to go for in college. So let me see.
So I think I understand what the student is saying. So the pathway they're in at their particular high school is emphasizing this engineering STEM side of things, but they get to the end of high school and they're like, no, that's not really what I want to do. I'd like to do business. I think I'm understanding that question that way. So look, colleges are very sympathetic to this idea that a young person will change their mind. But like I said, certain academic majors and programs are more competitive than others, and business is one, right? I mean, a lot of people want to go into business, and I would be worried about the students' chances of getting into a college of business if they didn't have any business experiences. And so it doesn't have to be necessarily in the high school curriculum, but are there things that the student can do in the summer through your program where they can get some more experiences to just add to their resume? then I feel much better about their chances. The other piece of advice I would offer, if it's just they're far along in high school and their resume is kind of set and they really want to do business, is apply to universities where, and many are like this, in fact, most are like this, that, okay, you can emphasize that your academic strengths are civil engineering. But once you're there, you've done the research to know that, hey, after a week, I could switch over into the business track, right? That I'm not going to be set on that path. So maybe apply to some universities that have that extra flexibility. But again, understanding that to get in, you need to be able to show that authentic development of your resume in the area you're interested in. So if that's not possible, you're probably going to need to find some schools that just give you the flexibility to change when you get there.
Thank you, Artie. Well, yeah, I mean, if you're aiming for a top school, I think it's clear from what you shared with us, there's a lot to know, and it's really valuable to have this type of advice. Can you tell us about the process for working with a client that you use on a college application?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and thank you for the opportunity to do that. So my colleagues and I work with high school students really of any age, although I think the ideal sweet spot to begin is towards the end of 10th grade through midway through 11th grade. That's like the perfect sweet spot for us to say, you know, we can help you with the main areas of developing a college list, clarifying your academic interests for that list of colleges, developing your resume, giving you advice on programs like yours to continue with or other programs to sign up with, and then working on the essays, because we work very closely with our students on the essay part. And we take students who are later along than that. We take younger students, any age, but that's, if a student's trying to think about when to begin, it's kind of like right now in 10th grade through kind of right now in 11th grade. That's that perfect window. If you start later, we can still help, but there's just a little bit less we can do in advising on resume things. And we were starting a little bit later on developing essays. So we work with students virtually, usually kind of meeting with them every other week, 30-minute sessions, and wanting to make sure, just to clarify, that college list is set and the academic interests are planned out so that you can be successful with those applications, advising on developing activities and summer programs that can add to their resume, and then brainstorming and helping them with their essays. And then, of course, at the very end, making sure the full application, the jigsaw puzzle comes together in the best possible way at the end of all of that. And so if a student's interested in working with us, our website, arthursmithadvising.com, has a link to my scheduling page. We offer complimentary 30-minute consultations for families to talk about that student's needs and goals and how we might be able to help them. And still definitely taking on clients for all grade years right now, and hope to hear from anybody that would be interested in working with us.
So you offer a free consultation to any student who wants to see how they might be able to work with you and build a better application?
Absolutely. And sometimes we have a consultation, I'll be completely candid, and I answer some questions. I give them 2 or 3 tips, and they're good to go, and they don't need to sign up with us. And I'll always be honest with the family, because they may be getting great guidance in high school and they just need a couple tips from us, and that'll work out great. But oftentimes, you know, even though the guidance counselors at the high school are working very, very hard and care deeply, they may have hundreds of students on their plate. And so that our consultation might lead to a decision to kind of work with us as your, I guess, your one-on-one guidance counselor or one-on-one coach for college admissions. And we'll see. But yeah, thank you. The complimentary consultation is something we really want to provide to anybody that's interested.
Yeah, I'll sign up too.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Great. Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to learn more about you and all that you know about college applications. And I hope to have you on again soon. I put your link up here in the chat, arthursmithadvising.com for everyone to click on. And thank you again. And
great. I appreciate the opportunity. Hope to meet up with you guys again down the road.
Thank you. All right.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.